Hey gamers, Rob from Zborgaming here, and today we're going to take a look at the weapons in Cyberpunk 2077. Now this is going to be part one of a several video series where I talk about some of the weapons within Cyberpunk. Today we're going to look at the handguns and the rifles. My initial intent was to go through all the weapons within Cyberpunk, but as I got going on this video and going into in-depth information on each of the weapons, I felt it would be best served to split it into a several video series instead of have one video that was 30 to 40 minutes long. So with that, let's go ahead and get started. So the first thing we want to look at here are all the weapon types in Cyberpunk 2077. Now, like I said earlier, we're going to focus on the handguns and the rifles. And later videos, we'll touch on the blades, shotguns, two-handed weapons, melee, and sniper rifles, as well as some other equipment that we've seen throughout the game. So the handguns and rifles are part of that reflex tree. But before we get to that, I want to talk a little bit about some of the weapon stats that we've seen in Cyberpunk. So what you will see is that during the gameplay, some of these pop-ups have popped up here, which give some information about the weapons. So here we have the name as well as the rarity, and there's 5 rarities on weapons within Cyberpunk. Common, uncommon, rare, epic, and legendary, and this color will change based off of the rarity of the weapon. For this image up here, you can see it's green, which means this is an uncommon weapon. So let's talk about the stats for a little bit. DPS is damage per second, and that's a good indicator of how much damage over time the weapon will do. So even if it has a very high damage, if it has a very slow rate of fire, you may not do as much damage as a lower damage weapon that has a very high rate of fire. So damage per second is probably your best indicator of how much damage you can output. PNT is penetration, and most likely this will be armor penetration. ACC is accuracy. We already mentioned ROF, rate of fire. And then we've got some additional stats here: recoil, spread, and range. Recoil will be the amount of vertical or horizontal recoil you will see after you shoot the weapon. Bullet spread will most likely factor into shotguns and the amount of spread that your bullets have. And then range, this is your ability to maintain that damage over an extended range. So you may have a shotgun that has a very high damage, but it's only effective at close range. Whereas a sniper rifle may have a high damage and a high range, but you'll have to be a lot more accurate with your shot. The other thing we don't see mentioned, at least in this visual here, is the damage type. Most of the weapons in Cyberpunk have a certain damage type, whether it's physical, thermal, electrical, or chemical. The image we see up here, we actually see a physical damage type. So your character does have certain resistances to certain types of damage. And so depending on what the damage type is, you can either do more or less damage to an opponent. So you'll want to be aware of that. Now, moving on into the handguns. I've got 4 classified right now as handguns within the game. This is the M10AF Lexington, the REAVER MDE 1984, an unnamed revolver, and the KANG Type 41, which also has a couple other names within the game, the KK68 and the G58 Dion. And the same goes for that M10AF Lexington. We see it called the Federated Arms Vindicator, as well as the MILITECH RKD-12. So we're going to take a look first here at the M10AF Lexington, and we actually see V picking this up in the armory. It has the stats here. We already went through those: the 79 DPS, 22 penetration, 12 accuracy, 8 rate of fire, and then 4, 4, and 9 for recoil, spread, and range. Other information we find out, and this is actually on the wall, is the RKD-12 at the gun shop, is that it has a 9mm round with a 1200 RPM and a 35-yard effective range. So what that basically tells you is that past 35 yards, the damage this thing is going to output is going to be pretty minimal. So we see a ton of gameplay with this particular weapon in the game, and so it looks like it's going to be a very common weapon within Cyberpunk. The same goes for the REAVER MDE 1984. We see a variety of characters using this weapon within the game. Jackie looks to be dual wielding this weapon. Has a 45 caliber round, 30 RPM, and a 50-yard effective range. And we actually see it listed right up here at the top on the board at the gun shop. That is that REAVER right up here. So we don't get a good look. That's about all we get as far as the stats on the weapon. But we do see a lot of characters throughout the game apparently wielding this gun. So it looks like it will be a fairly common handgun in the game. Next one we see here is a revolver, and we see a couple different gameplays of this. One is in the deep dive, where they're talking about the strong solo build, and the other here is where you're fighting Sasquatch. We don't have any additional stats on this weapon, but it appears to be quite strong, as you are taking out a very good opponent in Sasquatch here. But again, not a lot of information, but this looks to be quite a strong handgun within the game. And it is confirmed. Down here you can see you're earning handgun XP. So, next one we have here is the KANG Type 41. And in this case, you're picking it up in the factory. This is Royce's factory where the Maelstrom gang is at. Has 87 DPS, 12 penetration, 44 accuracy, and 15 rate of fire. We see V here have that in the inventory with the same stats. And this is more of a smart weapon. So you'll see that as the gameplay goes, you can basically fire this weapon and the bullets will track to an enemy that's within this square here. So here you can see he's firing up here at this Maelstrom ganger, taking him out, and some additional enemies back behind some of these plates. So we see a decent amount of gameplay from the KANG Tau. Also goes under a couple names, the KK68 and the G58 Dion. And in the gun shop, we do see an image of this weapon showing it's got a 10mm round, 950 RPM rate of fire, and a 220-yard effective range. So that's basically all we have on the handguns right now. Let's go ahead and move into the rifles. So in the rifle category, we have a whole handful to talk about here. Now, again, a brief disclaimer here. Not all these may actually be considered rifles within the game. They could be categorized slightly different. This was sort of my best guess as to where they'll be based off of their look and their appearance. So let's go ahead and get started here on the M221 Saratoga. So a little bit of gameplay here. We see it within the deep dive. We also see it a couple times in the gameplay videos. This particular clip was from the Netrunner section of the deep dive. Also shows that they have a silencer and an optic equipped on the weapon, and it looks to have 110 DPS and a physical damage. We don't really have any more information other than that, and the fact that it's an uncommon weapon within the game, but it does seem to have a fairly high DPS at 110. Moving on, we have the MILITECH ARC 44, and this is seen on the board at the gun shop. It's also seen as a cutout in V's Armory. You can see it's down here at the bottom, the MILITECH ARC 44. And what I was able to pull off of the board here, even though it's quite blurry, is that this has a 4.7mm round, 2200 RPM, and a 640-yard effective range. That seems like quite the range with a low caliber and a high fire rate. So I might be slightly off there, but it does look as if this is the weapon that fits into this cutout slot in V's Armory. Likewise, the next weapon we look at here, the Nova Griffin AC-104B, is also seen on the board right above that ARC 44, and it also has its own weapon slot in V's Armory. Now this weapon we have no information on. It basically says specification unknown, experimental. So this is an experimental type weapon. Again, I'm sort of classifying this as a rifle right now. We're not quite sure where it fits. It could be a shotgun, but at this point we're throwing it in the rifle category. Moving on to the next weapon, this is the MILITECH M31A1. And this weapon was picked up in the factory prior to battling with Royce. And you can see here that it has a 89 DPS, 15 penetration, 34 accuracy, a fairly slow rate of fire at 10. recoil 4, spread 5, and range 13. So this here is the pop-up that came up with the M31A1 rare weapon. And again, this is found in the Maelstrom factory prior to the battle with Royce. So next weapon we're going to look at here is what they call the Constitutional Arms M2067 Defender. This is some of the lore imagery we get of it, and this is a brief shot showing us reloading the weapon. Looks to have about 100 rounds in the clip after they reload. And we also see basically no other information on this weapon. But what we do see is right prior to picking up our next weapon, this heavy rifle, a brief glimpse of that 2067. So this is an unknown heavy rifle. We don't have any information on it other than we know it's a rifle because it's doing rifle damage over here. You can see that the character actually experiences up using this weapon. Again, no other information other than the fact that V ripped it off of what looked to be a weapon stand in some of the gameplay. This looks to be a fairly high damage weapon, as if we step back a second here and go ahead and restart the gameplay, does 217 damage crit. Let's see here, we got 100, 200, up to 238 damage with this particular weapon. So now there's a couple other rifles we see in some gameplay here. Again, we don't have any statistics or information on these rifles. Here we see a random gang member in the Maelstrom clan holding a rifle. And in the next gameplay, if I go ahead and pause it right here, we see a couple members of the Voodoo clan with another unknown rifle. So we don't have any weapons or information or stats on these, currently TBD. But again, another unknown rifle. So with that, those are the various weapons, handguns, and rifles that we're currently aware of in Cyberpunk 2077. Again, like I said, this is part 1 of a couple video series where we'll be going through the various weapons in Cyberpunk. Again, hey, thanks for watching. Please comment, like, subscribe, hit that bell notification so you can be notified on when our next weapon video comes out. Again, hey, thanks for watching.